Sweet girl, sweet, you know, fangirl. Jerry. Sigma is a collection of creatives who also have technical backgrounds. Okay, it originally started out as authors, but now we've incorporated game developers and stuff like that. Anyway, Jerry asked me if I'd like to join, and I said, that sounds like fun, because they consult as futurists for different organizations up to and including governments, and not just the U.S. government. So I said, sure. So I got nominated for membership by no less a personage than Jerry Purnell. And would you like to guess who seconded the nomination for membership? Dude named Larry Niven. So, all right, go on to the next slide, please. All right. This actually got presented as a paper at one of the early Tennessee Valley Interstellar workshops. So basically what happened was I was devastated in the aftermath of the Columbia disaster. I had taught Kalpana Chawla and trained her for her first shuttle mission. And she would probably get a kick out of the theme music. And so I'd actually written my first novel, and Travis Taylor, who was my writing mentor, had the manuscript in hand to help me. He was going to read it, help me polish it, and get it published. That book went on to become Burnout, my very first book. It was about a space shuttle disaster that turned out not to have been an accident, and the ensuing investigation and cover-up. But the gist of it was that my fictional scenario nailed what happened to Columbia, with the differences. There were only two differences. One, what happened to Columbia was accidental. What happened in my fictional scenario was sabotage. And two, the fictional debris field extended off the Texas coast well into the Gulf of Mexico. So Travis, the first task Travis had was talking me out of trashing the manuscript. I don't care how logical a person you are. When something like that happens, there's a little voice in the back of your head that says, it happened because you wrote it. And he had to basically convince me, no, Steph, look, you worked the program that long, you know your stuff, you wanted a particular mission profile for the purposes of the plot. And it just happened to be that was the same. And once you establish certain parameters, and he was right, once you establish certain parameters, the rest falls into place. The orbital inclination, the incoming trajectory, the approach to the K, all of that gets set. So, some years later, I got invited to participate in several events. One of those was a book signing at my old alma mater, my undergraduate alma mater. When I showed up early to help get set up and unload my books and stuff, there was a gentleman waiting on me. Hit the next slide, because I'm not sure. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. It's finally caught up to where I'm telling you about the story. The gentleman said that he was a field coroner that had participated in the investigation. He was one of the people that had gone out and collected the bodies. Back up one slide if you can, please. Oh, well, no, it's okay. Go ahead, because it had it on there. They were traveling at Mach 17 when the craft broke up. Okay. He actually had the autopsy reports, and the forensics reports there with him, because he said, I kind of had the impression that maybe you needed some closure here. And he was right. I didn't really realize it at the time, but he was right. And so I did get to look through the reports. A few things stand out. Notably, that at least one crew member was found body completely intact, except for some minor burns and abrasions on the ground. Cause of death was multiple blunt force traumas. And I looked up at the man and I said, does that mean he died when he hit? And he didn't say anything. This was the response that I got. Which means I can't say for sure, but probably. Now, that definitely provided closure, but it wasn't what I'd hoped for. I'd really kind of hoped that during the violence of the breakup, because, okay, what happened, real quick summation, the foam hit the underside of the wing, broke through the leading edge of the wing, gouged a groove on the bottom of the wing, took out some of the flashing around the wheel well. This resulted in blow-by into the interior of the wing and into the wheel well. Telemetry shows that as it got deeper into the atmosphere, the thermocouples along the leading edge of the wing began burning out sequentially from the point of entry, from the hole. And they had seen, without knowing exactly what it was, they had seen the flashing dislodge on orbit and float away. So the interior of the wing is heating up. The struts, the structural struts are softening because they're metal. The interior of the wheel well is heating up. The inflated tires are starting to expand. And what happened next? How many of you have ever seen a semi-tire explode as a result of a fire? All right. Now imagine something several times larger than that doing the same thing. And with structural integrity lost within the wing was torn off. So now you've got a bird with one wing coming in at Mach 17. What's going to happen? And it began to break up. So the crew hit atmosphere at Mach 17. So I was really, really hoping that the violence of the tumbling breakup would have knocked them out. Maybe even killed them outright at that point. And it may or may not have knocked them out. It evidently didn't kill them, or at least not all of them. And some of them fell. So like I said, y'all excuse me because this is kind of close. So I'm probably going to get a little wobbly. I may tear up at some point. Next slide. Later that same year, I was asked to participate in an astronaut memorial service. And then still later that year, Felix Baumgartner did his record-breaking space skydive. And I was actually it was the Sunday of a convention, and there was a mass book signing and in the lobby of the hotel, and they had a big screen TV, and basically we halted everything to watch this. And I was about to go nuts because I'm thinking, am I about to, if this is unsuccessful, if he doesn't make it, am I going to see what happened to my friend in action, live, on TV? Obviously, he made it, for which I was extremely thankful. And I started realizing, damn, maybe he didn't, maybe the crew didn't have to die. Maybe there was something that could have been done, some mitigation, some escape system that would have enabled them to survive. So I started wondering if we could do something about this, but I realized, I don't have a material science background. I don't have an engineering background. I am a scientist. I have degrees in astronomy, physics, chemistry, mathematics, and some secondary specialties like geology. I don't have, I can come up with concepts, but I don't have the requisite knowledge to put them into practice, to actually build the thing. So I contacted my friends at Sigma, and I popped out the whole idea into our discussion forum. And I said, is there anybody here who would be willing to work with me on this? And so Tom Ligon, who I knew from some of the consulting work that we had done together as Sigma, and Arlen Andrews, the founder, volunteered to work with me, and they thought it was kind of cool. Next slide. So we realized that if we could get this to work, it didn't necessarily have to be an Earth-based thing. And we realized we could use it anywhere, and conceivably it could be used not just as an emergency atmospheric entry, but as some sort of a regular atmospheric entry, or even be used for equipment. So, but it should be able, by the time we were done, to protect individual crew members from harm and to effect a safe landing. Next slide. So Arlen is retired, and he worked, geez, the things that man has done would just, I really wish I could get him to write a memoir, because the things that man has done are just amazing. And he can tell stories, oh my gosh. And so it turns out that, unbeknownst to me, Baumgartner wasn't the first to have done this. Joe Kittinger did it back in 1960, which there's a reason why I don't remember that, because that's when I was born. It actually took place a month. So very similar thing. It's just that Baumgartner went higher. So next slide. And so you can see this is not Baumgartner. None of this is Baumgartner. Except I think, no, Baumgartner was in a white suit. So all of this was Kittinger. Next slide. So there was our first concept, was, okay, we have to have something that will slow the guy down and that will deploy a parachute to help slow him even further. So then we started thinking about, well, what about the atmospheric effects on the human? And Arlen said, well, maybe what we need to do is develop some sort of a structure around the astronaut. And so he was used to working with these polyurethane foams. And we thought, oh, you know what? That might work. So let's see what we can come up with here. Next slide. And so these were the systems that he was used to working with. And basically what it amounted to was that the electronic components, which at that point in time were much less sophisticated than they are today, the launch and ascent tended to shake things loose, which made it not work too good. And so what they would do was they would spray this foam in there to hold everything in place, because it would solidify and become a lightweight solid and lock everything in position so nothing could shake loose, which we thought sounded kind of interesting. Next slide. And so we said, okay, well, maybe this can be a component. Next slide. So Arlen was actually thinking, and somebody came up to me this morning, was talking about, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could actually make space jumping a sport? Well, Arlen already had that idea. So, you know, okay, fine. Let's get it working as an emergency escape route first. You know? But as we discussed it, we realized that this was tying in with stuff that I was coming up with and Tom was coming up with. So Arlen, Tom, and I were already thinking on the same lines. And this proved to be a good thing. Next slide. So what we wound up settling on is we wanted to have an emergency deployment of a specially shaped bag that would fill with foam to form an aero brake. And do you know what the shape that I'm talking about when I refer to an aero brake? Is anybody that doesn't know what I'm talking about? Okay. Remember back in the era of Apollo, the bottom of the Apollo capsule, the heat shield area during reentry, that's an aero brake. Okay, so what we wanted was something that one side of it had that shape. And it turns out that the capsule design was really very good, because that shape will automatically tend to fall in the correct orientation. So then we wanted to make sure that turns out that really it's possible that all you need, if the astronaut is falling backwards in a seated position with an air brake back there, all he may need over him is a thermal blanket, because that's going to be taking the brunt and it's going to be blowing out and around. But and then we would have an automatic parachute deployment once a set altitude or pressure had been reached. And we were going to assume that the flight seat, that this was an integral part of the flight seat, which would remain intact and enable the astronaut to sit in it and everything to deploy from it. So it would literally be kind of an escape pod. Next slide. So these were some of the concepts that we drew from. And they were actually looking at this as a possibility some years earlier. And they actually have used something like this for equipment, and especially on Mars. They wound up jettisoning the aero brake before it landed. But remember the one that bounced across? All right, next slide. So with this general concept, we started looking at determining what materials we would need to use. If there were no suitable materials extant already on the market, then we would have to look at modifying the concept or developing suitable materials ourselves. So we were really hoping we could find something. So upon some recommendations by both Arlen and Tom, Tom was a materials engineer, so he knew what he was doing here. And Arlen's just had so much darn experience that he's got there. So Tom began initial materials testing for some proof of principle stuff. Next slide. So it turns out that he was able to get hold of some polyisocyanurate. Excuse me, my throat is drying out. Polyisocyanurate foam insulation of the sort that might be used in one of those rockets that Arlen was talking about. It was currently being marketed as building insulation, interestingly enough, which actually is one of the things that tends to happen with space development materials, is they get passed on to more mundane uses. So we had some knowledge of their expected thermal abilities as a result, which was kind of nice. And I'm not going to go into the details here. You can read them on the chart. Next slide. And so here's a little bit more about the specifics. I'm not going to go into it because I don't think anybody here is really interested in that much technical data. Just know that we were doing this very scientifically. We were serious about this, very, very serious about this. Next slide. And so here's what we're looking at. We're looking at a couple of blocks of this stuff, and we applied thermocouples in various positions so that we could get a feel for the temperature and the heat flow in the material. Next slide. So basically one of the things that we did was we sandwiched thermocouples between a couple of pieces of the foam. And we wanted to see how much heat passed through the foam. Now, what were we going to use to heat it? Well, we're getting to that. Next slide. So we're still giving you an indication of how this was set up. So the top flap comes down, and so the thermocouple is in between. Next slide. There's all the information on the equipment we used to obtain data. Next slide. And he basically used a blowtorch because he had a blowtorch that would reach the approximate temperatures that we were looking at, because we had calculated what to expect. That information is pretty well known anyway. And so this gives you an idea of what the material did. Yes, the material burned. This is what we want. It will ablate. That is how the heat is carried away. That's how it was carried away on Apollo, Gemini, Mercury. It's how it works. The heat shielding ablates in the atmosphere and carries, as it burns and sloughs off, it carries heat away with it. Next slide. And so we see the red trace is the face of the foam, the top of the sandwich that was directly exposed to the flame. And then the orange trace is the thermocouple that was between the foam blocks. And notice it actually did quite nicely. Yes, it would have been warm. It would have been too warm for an astronaut, but we weren't using really thick foam blocks either. Yay thick. Okay? And notice how long it lasted. Peak temperature wasn't reached until after the torch was turned off. Next slide. Yes, yes. All right, so this is the thermal image of the rear of the sandwich. So, and that's 8 minutes, okay? So that's a pretty good long test. And yeah, it did get warm. Like I said, it'd been too warm for an astronaut, but I mean, you're looking at, okay, if you got two blocks of foam, yay thick, you're looking at a maximum of about this. We'd certainly have more than that behind the astronaut. Next slide. And so the we start at this point. Tom started playing around with the positioning a little bit to see what angles and airflow and things like that had to do with the price of tea in China, or the price of bat meat in China, as the case may be. We also tried it. We started thinking about, okay, well, the foam has to be contained within something, because the foam starts out, if our concept is utilized, the foam starts out as a 2-component liquid, and it has to be blown into something that will have the shape that we want. So he started adding a layer of basic fiberglass to it, basically woven fiberglass. Next slide. And so here's our 4-minute test result. Doggone, look at that. That looks pretty darn good. Next slide. 2 minutes ain't diddly squat. Next slide. 1 minute didn't do anything. So, you know, it depends how long is this going to take. And frankly, it's going to depend on several things. One is, where do you need to execute your emergency bailout procedure? How far up or how far down? Which is also going to determine what speed you're traveling. You know, if you're traveling at Mach 20 and you're high up in the atmosphere, you may well experience a much longer period of intense heating than if you've already slowed down to about Mach 5 and you're only a few miles up. Next slide. Interestingly, the fiberglass skin, which did melt within just seconds, but it actually seemed to improve the thermal stability and the lack of conductivity of the overall mix. Next slide. And so this will give you a comparison. These are the blocks, the face blocks after being exposed. So you've got the 8-minute on the top, the 4-minute, the 2-minute, the 1 minute, and then 4 minutes with the fiberglass. Note the penetration for the 4-minute test without the fiberglass versus the 4-minute test with the fiberglass. It is. So, you know, we thought this was quite promising at this point. Next slide. And so this is just a table of basically what you just saw. Also, the 8-minute specimen actually bowed out on the back. There was a significant dome on the back surface, which allowed for a browning depth which exceeded its original thickness, but it did not actually penetrate all the way through. So this was a direct communique from Tom. and we just stuck it directly in. What we had would probably have worked if we had, all we had to do was determine the thickness needed to protect the astronaut and provide comfortable ambient temperature for him. There are other options that we could use, and there are various trade-offs that we can make. And so we decided that we actually did have a viable concept here at this point. Next slide. So there are a number of materials that we could use. And melamine, if I recall correctly, was actually a product of the early space program. And in terms of, let's say we want to go to another star system, some of this stuff you can synthesize from stuff that you would find as you traveled, believe it or not. Urea and formaldehyde are common in interstellar ices. They're common in comet ices. So there's games we can play depending on where we're going. Next slide. And so we already know that you can get the 2-component foam kits commercial off the shelf. So we're thinking, a cubic meter of foam can produce a stable structure almost 3 meters in diameter and 15 centimeters thick. Next slide. This is one of the concepts that we're looking at for the shape. And oh, by the way, did I mention we have a preliminary patent on all this at this point? So my husband's a graphics artist. He threw together some stuff for us. The concept that we had here was something akin to a soccer ball. And so the astronaut is in a specially developed chair. And what we wanted to do was have something simple. He would be in his suit. We would go back to, as NASA did, go back to the concept of re-entry in environment suits. Because the environment suit itself provides us a considerable amount of thermal protection. And that might just be the saving grace, whereby we can minimize what we need to do with SPEARD, because we have now raised the ambient temperature, comfort temperature for the astronaut by him wearing or her wearing the environment suit. Yes. It is now. It was not at the time of the Columbia disaster. They had ditched the concept of wearing the environment suits for reentry at that point. They were coming in shirt sleeves. The uniform jumpsuits, that's what they were wearing. After that, it was a process. It was a gradual process during the run of the shuttle program. Yeah. Well, there would have been no particular. Yes, it was after Challenger, but it was not as a result of Challenger, because Challenger was an ascent disaster and ascent phase, and there was no. That had no impact on the entry phase of the mission. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. So between Challenger and Columbia, they got into the habit of re-entry in short sleeves, basically a shirt sleeve environment. And one of these days, what I need to try and do is to get a video to include in here of the what it looks like out the flight deck windows during reentry, because you can't see anything. It looks like somebody is hitting the front of the shuttle with a giant blowtorch. It looks like flame hitting the windows. And that's another reason why you can't talk to them either during that point in time, because there's nothing but a big cloud of plasma around the craft, and you can't get a radio signal through it. So anyway, this is one concept. I don't know if we ever developed, if I got my husband to design one with an aero brake, but this would actually work because it's a sphere. A sphere is close enough to an aero brake shape that it would work. And the other is that that broad curved shape, and then basically kind of a conical or hemispherical shape over the astronaut. So the aero brake would be to the left there. And notice that the thickness is greater behind the astronaut. He's actually facing upward in the image on the right. He would be facing upward towards the bottom of the chute, coming down on his back. That also actually minimizes the G stresses on him. Next slide. So basically, we concluded that our type of foam, the family of polyisocyanurate foams, would be capable of doing this. And they have excellent thermal insulation. They're very nicely rigid. They maintain their structural integrity under heat, and they have a tendency to char and decompose and slough away, ablate, rather than melt, which is extremely important for heat shield. And so it may be that all we really need is the right shape and about 10 to 15 centimeters worth of thickness. Pardon? Sorry, I just mumbled that's amazing because that's not very thick. No, it's not. It's also very light. And so that may be sufficient to protect against LEO reentry conditions. Especially if you, okay, what we wound up coming up with, and this is what the patent is for, is a bag made out of to be determined material, possibly as simple as the fiberglass, woven fiberglass, that is designed when inflated to take the shape that we wanted, whether spherical or aerobrake, and to be filled with the foam as soon as the astronaut triggered the appropriate mechanism in the chair. And we were thinking, since he'd be in a suit, and the suits are bulky and difficult to move in, we were thinking something as simple as grabbing a couple of bars and bringing them together in front of him. And I use him generically. I'm kind of old-fashioned with my English. I wanted to be an astronaut myself, so it's just as apt to be a her. But if you do that, then that would initiate probably underneath the seat, and it would expand. And as soon as the balloon, the bag expanded, the foam, the two-component foam would initiate and begin filling the bag. Now, it's entirely possible you'd have to crack the thing to get the astronaut out, but that's better than bouncing on the ground. And it would have a parachute in the chair that would deploy when sensors reached a certain altitude. And it would basically just pop a hole through and deploy the parachute. Yes. Well, that's coming from the suit. And that was another reason for having them wearing the suit, was to ensure that there was an oxygen flow. And again, you can have an emergency supply of oxygen contained in the chair. We discussed that also. We need to figure out if it was needed. Because offhand, I don't know what the capacity of the suit is. Yes. There was a time I could have answered that question off the top of my head, but I've been out of the program for a while. Trying to remember how long it took Baumgartner. You're probably looking at 4 to 5 minutes. And one of the problems that Baumgartner had was that he went into a flat spin. And the centrifugal force very nearly caused him to pass out, and that would have been catastrophic because his parachute was not automatically deployed. But he managed to pull out of the flat spin. Flat spins are common in situations like that. One of the problems with the X-15 was that it had a tendency upon reentry, if they didn't get it just exactly right, it would go into a flat spin. And it was a flat spin is, if the object is in this plane, it's a spin about the vertical axis, which means I can't do it with my hand, but and it's you're skipping a rock across a pond. The rock is in a flat spin, and that kind of gives you an idea of what the spacecraft wants to do in the atmosphere. In the case of Baumgartner, it was simply a case of just the centrifugal force was going to make him pass out if he wasn't careful. Yes. 5 minutes? Okay. Next slide. Okay. It sounded like it's coming from the table. Oh, okay. Next slide. Oh, okay, wait. So basically, we have a basic concept here, and we have a valid concept. What we need is more testing. We need to know specific type of foam. We need to know, because we look at generic foam. Okay, we now have determined a very basic family of foams that we can use. We need to determine the specific foam. We need to determine what shape we need the bag to assume when inflated. Does it need to be spherical? Does it need to try to have an aerobrake? Spherical is obviously the easiest, but it may be better if we try to go more sophisticated with an aerobrake because it may slow us down faster. And in terms of long distance travel, can we manufacture the foam en route or at destination? We're looking at having the crew person in a seat, almost done, for structural integrity, to provide power to the system, for the deployment, and for life support. And next slide. And so these are the things that we need to determine. Now, the interesting thing is that NASA has computer systems, modeling systems, where we can do all of this, but to be able to do it when we're not working for NASA, we have to pay for it. And we already kind of exhausted our out-of-pocket expenses in the testing that we've already done. So we've really been kind of hoping that somebody would pick us up as, hey, this is a good idea. Let's support you, DARPA or NASA or somebody. So far that hasn't happened. So we're still working on this. So we don't know what shape it needs to be. We don't know exactly how thick it needs to be. We don't know what we need to make the bag out of. We need to work on the details of the parachute deployment. Where exactly is it going to be deployed from? What altitude does it need to deploy? All this kind of stuff. So these are the things that we hope to determine. And next slide. So this was my friend. We called her KC because a lot of people couldn't pronounce Kalpana Chawla. She was from India. And so we're working on it. And that's about as much as I can tell you right now. Hopefully you found it interesting. And, if you know somebody in a position to be able to help us out, tell them about it. I don't want this to happen. I worked with enough astronauts in the course of my career. It was hard enough having it happen to one person I knew. I don't want it to happen to anybody else ever again. So, thank you.